that conflicts with the science in terms of brain development and the impact of cannabis on the brain up until 25. So, has the minister spoken to the CMA about their concerns? Does she see the adverse health impacts for young people up to age 25 as being a critical risk with cannabis? And how does this bill address that risk?
L'honorable ministre de la Santé.
Well, Minister of Health. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Colleague for his question. Mrs. Speaker, first of all, we have to recognize that the present approach on cannabis is certainly not working, and we are actually presenting a solution to an existing problem. We recognize that many of our Canadian youth are already consuming cannabis, and they are obtaining the product illegally, and the product is not regulated or controlled. Therefore, our approach is actually a public health approach. We are taking this in a way that we truly want to make sure that we are legalizing, strictly regulating, and restricting access to cannabis to our youth. When it comes to the age of 18, Madam Speaker, we have consulted broadly with the task force, and the task force has made that recommendation. With respect to provinces and territories, we are all aware, however, that if they choose to admit the age higher than 18, it is absolutely their choice. But again, I have to make it very clear. We are taking a public health approach with respect to Bill C-45, as we want to protect the health and safety of our children. And again, during this process, we are certainly not encouraging the use of cannabis. Quite to the contrary, we want to make sure that we can limit access to our youth.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
You know, in my riding, I have not heard a positive word in regards to this legislation.
Exactly.
I know. First off, the police force, the schools, the health providers, the young people in my riding see this as anything but positive for our culture and for our young people. They know, the young people in the schools, from the moment that this government won its opportunity to govern, whenever I was in a school, which was often, the first question they asked me is, what do you think about legalizing marijuana? Of course, I reversed the question back to them. Their response was, we don't want this. Does our health minister not understand that when the science says that this will cause damage to the brains of our young people up to the age of 25, that she is encouraging a behavior that is not positive for the very people that she's responsible for? And I want to ask her if she's prepared for what is going to come forward in the next 3 years and how in the world they would turn this around. I believe the only reason we're looking
at the Minister de la Santé.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Other questions, and I've allowed some flexibility as to the length of the question. So,
thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for her question. Actually, Mrs. Speaker, to the contrary, we are actually presenting a solution to an already existing problem that's occurring in our country. We recognize that the rate of Canadians that consume cannabis is extremely high, and we are absolutely taking a public health approach when it comes to this. We want to make sure that we legalize, that we strictly regulate, and that we control access to cannabis, specifically to our youth. And that is why with Bill C-45 we are bringing forward this legislation, because we want to address exactly that. We again want to make sure that our youth, we are not encouraging the use of cannabis by any means, but we do recognize that our Canadian youth, that the rate of consumption is already very high, and we are absolutely addressing that specific issue.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville. Oops.
Madam Speaker, the minister mentioned how safety's of concern. Now, I know in my riding, I've seen young people actually lose their life in what's deemed a drug deal gone wrong. So if the minister could please just address how we're going to keep young people safe.
Honorable Minister de la Santé.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. Again, I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. As indicated, we are absolutely providing a solution to an existing problem that already exists today, because we recognize that many youth are consuming cannabis that is illegal, unregulated, and the list goes on. Through Bill C-45, we have made significant investments with respect to education and awareness. We want to make sure that we start that process before actually the bill receives royal assent. And afterwards as well. So we are actually going to be starting a public education campaign and have already done so actually with examples like drug-free kids. We've been able to partner with them, and over 120,000 drug-free kits tools have already been given to Canadians. And that tool really provides Canadians with information regarding the risks associated to cannabis, and it will also provide parents, service providers, and mentors to children with the information that they need to have that difficult conversation that sometimes that they will be needed to have with the youth.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Courtenay, Columbia.
Madam Speaker, New Democrats support the legalization of cannabis, and we're supportive of Bill C-45.
I'll go to you next.
Expected this government to be respectful of the concerns of the provinces. I'd like to ask the Minister of Health a simple question. Why on the very day the provinces were asking for more time would this government impose time allocation on Bill C-45? Why would the Liberal government be so disrespectful, Madam Speaker?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Speaker. Actually, Madam Speaker, since our party formed government, we have been working with provinces and territories in preparation of Bill C-45. We continue to have high-level meetings with provinces and territories and Indigenous leaders every 3 weeks, actually, in order to properly prepare for the royal assent of this bill. So this has come to no surprise to Canadians and to provinces and territories. We work in close collaboration with our provinces and territories, and we will continue to do so all the way through the process of this legalization.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not quite sure who the honourable colleague is talking about, who they're working very closely through, because both provincial organizations, provinces, municipal governments, as well as police authorities right across our nation are all asking for more time for this legislation to go through so that they can prepare. Madam Speaker, I also met with Indigenous leaders from my area in northern British Columbia this past week, and they're all saying the same thing. We face an incredible amount of trouble with the timing that this bill is coming through. They're combating drug use and trying to educate their youth against drug use, and all of a sudden this bill is going to come in and they're rushing it through, and those services are not being provided, the tools are not being provided to help combat it. So my question to you, Madam Speaker, to the honourable colleague, which Indigenous communities are you working with? What is your plan? What is the plan for the government to go into these communities to try and combat the excessive drug use that this legislation will promote?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Once again, we have been committed to working closely with provinces and territories and Indigenous leaders. As indicated, we have committee that works or that meets once every 3 weeks with provinces, territories, and our Indigenous leaders to actually make sure that we are properly prepared for once this bill receives royal assent and that we can move forward. We are absolutely committed to working with our Indigenous communities, and once again, we are working closely with them. We continue to have dedicated discussions to share information and to understand the unique Indigenous perspectives when it comes to this bill. So again, we have been working closely for the past 2 years, and we will continue to do so to ensure that we can have timely passage of this bill.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Nanaimo, Lady Smith.
I want to follow up on the question posed by my colleague from Courtenay, Alberni. The minister says that she is talking with Indigenous leaders and ministers of health and justice from across the country repeatedly. However, they are still very unhappy, as are police chiefs, about the lack of time to implement this extremely complicated move to legalize marijuana. This is a huge download on the provinces and territories. And so I ask again through you, Madam Speaker, how can the Minister of Health say that she is consulting when she is still refusing to give provinces and territories more time, and she has shut down debate in this House? It's undemocratic and unfair.
Hear, hear.
A brief answer from the Minister of Health.
Madam Speaker, I can absolutely confirm that we are consulting with provinces and territories and Indigenous leaders. Actually, just last month, I had my first provincial and territorial meetings I had my first provincial and territorial meetings that were held in Alberta, and we had a wholesome discussion with, and also our Indigenous leaders were there, with respect to the issue of this bill. So with respect to the consultation approach, we are absolutely full out in doing that. Mrs. Speaker, we have to recognize that the current approach to cannabis is just not working, and that is why the urgency in moving forward. We recognize that Canadian youth right now have access to cannabis, and we want to legalize, strictly regulate, and to control access to ensure that our children won't have access to cannabis. That's exactly why we're moving forward with respect to this process.
I just want to remind the member from Caribou Prince George of the heckling, the rules regarding the heckling, and there are other hecklers in the House, and it's starting to get a little bit stronger. So I would just remind members that they're not to be heckling while someone else is speaking. Resuming debate, reprise de